Jonny, welcome to Grief and Pizza. Jonny Miller from Nervous System Mastery fame and the Curious Humans podcast. I guess at this point, you're kind of what I think of as the nervous system guy in the same way that Marie is the Notion gal. And I took the Nervous System Mastery course in early 2023. And I really enjoyed in the program how you had the people do an explain like I'm five. So whenever we would consume the material, we would go to our group and then explain what we thought we understood to a 5-year-old. And so I'd love to start off by you just maybe doing an explain like I'm five on what the nervous system is and why it's so important in your work in what I think of as like creating an operating manual for your nervous system.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. You probably opened with the toughest question of all, so thank you for that. Yeah, the game is called the Feynman technique, and it's like a way of attempting to explain stuff without using long words. So I'll try and do that myself. So nervous system mastery is learning how to be less reactive and more alive in your life. And at the same time, listening to your body and being in tune in the same way that you might have an instrument or a guitar that goes out of tune. Every once in a while, you have to kind of tune yourself up in order to play good music. And our bodies are like these instruments. So I consider nervous system mastery as the practice, the skill of tuning up the instruments of our body. Yeah, I like that. That's pretty good.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
Yeah. I think actually one of the things that struck me about the program almost immediately in the very first lesson, and I went back and was watching it again today, was you start out by introducing this concept that you had been living your life sort of numb from the neck down. So without this somatic experience of your body being totally disconnected and being up in your head all the time. And when I was taking the course, it just resonated with me so strongly where I was just like, oh my goodness, like we often end up so in our heads about things and not really, letting it settle into the body and things like that. And that very first lesson was this incredible TED talk that you gave at Ubud TEDx about losing your ex-fiance and your experience with grief. And I've always wondered, was that kind of like the impetus for this work where you started really diving deeply into that body feel and exploring that grief? Or was there something prior to that? What set you on the journey to developing this sort of guidebook for other practitioners?
Oh, thank you for the beautiful question. So I would say that I've always been curious about the question of like how to live a good life. Like I studied philosophy at university, and I've always been interested in that. But I'd say up until that kind of journey through grief, it was a very intellectual pursuit, and I was kind of figuring out like what are the right principles to live by, and what are my values, and like reading Plato and Aristotle and that type of stuff. I would say I had like an initial wake up call of sorts when I left my first startup and I went through burnout, and it was a very humbling experience, and more unlearning, detaching my identity from my work and the startup that I was doing. And that was definitely a kind of like one catalyst. But yeah, honestly, it was the journey of grief, which I'd never, I'd managed to live 27 years without experiencing, I'd say, any real emotional hardship. I mean, besides losing my grandma when I was like 11, I'd never really been through anything like emotionally tough or challenging before. And losing my former fiance in such a unexpected and kind of sudden way it just kind of obliterated me in a really kind of beautiful way. And I realized very early on that, or at least I didn't realize, but I had the sense that I'd seen adults who had lost someone close to them, usually much older, and it seemed like they hadn't really grieved the loss. And something about them to me felt like they were almost like hollow kind of husks of beings. There was this like lack of aliveness or like lethargy that really scared me. And I kind of saw myself like, if I went down the trajectory that I was on, which was this, relatively, I wasn't totally emotionally disconnected, but I was not at all in touch with my body or feelings. And so in some ways I was like, okay, I'm going to turn towards this, and I'm going to do my best to create the conditions to feel this grief and this heartbreak that was terrifying to feel. Like it really, if I kind of think back to like the weeks afterwards, I would say were just almost pure shock. Like, I wouldn't say denial, but it was just too overwhelming to comprehend what had happened fully. And I was kind of in the, like going through the, I called it like deathman, like the logistics of like organizing the memorial and seeing people and consoling the family and things like that. And it wasn't really until I had spaciousness 3 or 4 months later that I really allowed myself to like be hit by the tsunamis of grief, and signed up for Vipassana, which was at the time a terrifying proposition, to kind of spend 10 days in total silence without anyone else and just sitting with that and nothing else. But yeah, it really was the journey through grief that kind of opened up the Pandora's box, so to speak, to not only that experience, but many other things from my life, which I hadn't given myself. I didn't even know that I was holding. And I think it's the phrase of like numb from the neck down is interesting, because I only realize it now that I have something to contrast it with. But if I'd heard that phrase in my early 20s, it wouldn't have really made sense, because I wouldn't have had anything to compare it to. I'm like, oh no, I can feel I can pinch myself. I can feel that like I have a body. And so, yeah, it's something that only, I guess, makes sense in hindsight.
I'm curious what some of the resources you had at that time, because I can imagine it would be really easy to kind of go inward or maybe disconnect from people, and it would be such a sort of lonely, isolating experience. But how did you even get exposed to the idea of doing a Vipassana, or, you know, who were your support systems during that time, or even your influences that were maybe opening your eyes to a different way of approaching grief?
Beautiful. I was very fortunate that I had some really just beautiful close friends at the time that really showed up for me in a beautiful way. I remember one guy, his name's Stu. He took a 2-hour train down to Brighton where I was living and brought like a home-baked casserole, gave it to me, gave me a hug and had a cup of tea, and then went back home. And it was just like moments like that where people just really showed up for me in such a beautiful way that I feel like was so essential, particularly in the immediate aftermath. And one of the gifts of the grieving process, I think, is that I felt so much closer to many of these people during and after that process. Like, it really did forge friendships in a really beautiful way. And I'd say, like, I'd been interested in meditation before this, and I think I'd been kind of loosely considering it, like a Vipassana, a year before. And so, I might have even, I think I'd even signed up for it before this had happened. So it was more just the decision of like, am I going to go through with this now that the context seems very different? So I'd say the curiosity that I had that was mostly directed to the outer worlds, like travel, startups, learning, that was starting to go inwards, I guess. So there was like an initial curiosity there, but I didn't really have many other resources just besides, very caring, loving friends.
Amazing. I want to ask too about the burnout you mentioned even before this. So you were in the startup world, and what were some of those initial signs of burnout? Because I think a lot of folks maybe don't even notice when they're in that. So if you were very in your head, how did that start to show up for you, that you were maybe beginning to notice that there's something you're not listening to, or that you were on the path to burnout?
Yeah. So I'd say that my burnout was, it means different things to different people. For me, it was waking up in the morning with a sense of like, not dread, but just like zero desire to continue doing the work that I was doing. I remember reading, there was a phrase by Annie Dillard. She says, how we spend our days is in the end how we spend our lives. And that phrase at the time hit me like a ton of bricks, because I believed in the vision and the mission for what we were doing with Maptia. But I realized that on a daily basis, I was basically being like an email monkey, and I just was not enjoying the work itself that I was doing. I wasn't exercising my creativity. I didn't really see a path forward that could bring that alive. And so it was more of a realization of like, I'm not coming alive in the work that I'm doing, and the kind of low-level depression that kind of came with that. And just being like brutally honest with myself of like where I was at, and that this thing that I'd poured half a decade into might not be the thing that I was meant to do for the rest of my life.
I've had a lot of conversations recently with founders who have left behind some sort of business, and I'm getting the sense that there's actually, like the way that you described somebody kind of walking around as a husk, that I think that these failed businesses often leave behind this husk of an intention that people have for their lives, and then that a lot of people aren't sufficiently actually grieving the loss of a business because there's like a death of an identity that gets people get very attached. And I think there's even like some theories that our entrepreneurial like ideations are similar to a child type attachment in attachment theory. And that when we have that sense of loss, that like it leaves us feeling completely despondent and a little bit flaily, and we're not actually taking the time to actually grieve that process. So one of the things I did for when we shut down our software as a service was actually kind of like creating almost like a ceremonial like shutdown type thing, where I planned a project to end it and write about it and kind of, so have some actual kind of grieving process for leaving behind these ideas. Did you ever have any sort of sense of that as you left that behind, or, some unfelt emotions as you were, going through that process of, because that sounded like around the time that you were talking about feeling that numbness from the neck down, and what did you go through as a process of that 10 years of, you know what I mean? The sense of loss there.
I completely agree with you. And I think that in my experience, the grief comes from these identities or these parts of ourselves that die. And I remember at the time I had a friend, his name's Tom Nixon, that actually encouraged me to create a kind of ritual around it, and a kind of like a ritual letting go. And he works with founders to kind of design ritual experiences to kind of like, whether it's like beginnings or ends or closings. And I actually didn't do anything. I wish that I'd taken his advice, but I did not have any kind of ritual. And I remember kind of this sense of, it was almost like I'd like lost my life raft and I was just kind of adrift. And the life raft had been my identity as a founder, which had given me, in my view, some like validation. It was like, oh, he's like doing the startup thing. There was some kind of social status there. And I remember without that, there was this sense of like, who am I? Like, are my friends still going to want to hang out with me? Just, stupid things like that. But they were very alive at the time. And I do think that even in my case of losing Sophie, my partner, the grief was connected to grieving both current and future identities that I had for myself. So the initial grief was grieving like not having her there present, and then there was the grieving of not being a husband and a father with her, and grieving the kind of future identity of the life that we'd projected out and planned for the next 5+ years. And also grieving, I remember there were like, I went to different places that represented different parts of our relationship and different parts of my identity, and in each of those places it was almost like there were like horcruxes. And I remember like going to a train station that had been meaningful for us and just like breaking down and sobbing in the middle of this like public train station because I was hit with this memory. And so part of my journey was deliberately going back to some of the places that were most meaningful and creating mini rituals there to kind of surface those kind of pieces of grief that had been left behind.
Beautiful.
It's really beautiful.
That grief process, it's not a one-time thing, right? It's like the waves kind of keep hitting you in different ways over time. How did this process of kind of working through the grief end up informing this nervous system work that you're doing today? Like, how did that happen? How did it shape? It feels like this grief had a big influence on the work that you're doing today, obviously. So, how did that get integrated?
I actually feel emotion, like hearing that question. It informed all of it in a way. The kind of the way that the 3 or 4 years unfolded for me was initially the Vipassana meditation retreat, and then I returned to Bali because for me that felt like a very like nurturing and nourishing place. And when I was in Bali, I did a freediving training with this great guy, and he guided me through a breathwork journey, which I hadn't come across before. And during that journey, it was like 90 minutes. I had a just incredibly emotional, powerful kind of release, just like streaming tears. And towards the end of it, I felt this bliss and this level of joy that I hadn't, ever really experienced before, certainly not in the context of grief. And so after that, I was like, holy crap, like there's something here. Both I want to do this more selfishly because I feel like there's so much more for me to explore and feel, but also this is really interesting. And so I ended up doing a bunch of different breathwork trainings, as it turned out, holotropic and some other ones. But I eventually met this guy, Ed, in Bali, who ran a 9-month training called Facilitated Breath Repatterning. And it was really during those 9 months and learning about polyvagal theory, learning about the nervous system, and not only learning it intellectually, but seeing how the theory was then coming to life in these breathwork journeys as I was guiding myself and other people through it, and just becoming fascinated by it. And then as the training was coming towards an end, realizing that the nervous system was kind of the common thread between a lot of these things that I was interested in and also a lot of the challenges that people were facing. In that nervous system dysregulation, which is quite a broad term, but it's basically the underlying cause of things like anxiety, burnout, reactive behavior, certain health challenges. And so just becoming really fascinated by that and learning, reading books. There's books by Kathy Kane, Nurturing Resilience was fantastic, learning about the breath and how the way that we breathe impacts the way that we feel and the types of thoughts that we have. And so that was really like the rabbit hole that I was just like, okay, I'm gonna do a deep dive here. There's something fascinating here, and I want to learn it for myself. And maybe one day I'll share it and teach it to other people.
I was going to ask, was there a moment when you felt there's something here, I've got some traction in terms of like, maybe I'll teach this eventually? Or did you kind of always have an idea that you've always been a teacher and that you were moving towards that? Or how did it turn from just a exploration to, hey, this is something I could actually have a meaningful, business income around? When did that kind of transition happen for you?
Yeah, I can actually pinpoint the exact moment. I was in Japan. I'd spontaneously gone to a retreat run by this guy called Jan Chipchase and Craig Mudd. And I remember the day after the retreat, I stayed a day extra and I was rehearsing the TEDx talk that you mentioned earlier about grief with one of the other participants. And Jan, who was organizing, kind of overheard me practicing the speech, basically. And this began a conversation around burnout, around resilience. He works in kind of extreme environments in the kind of like a research capacity. And over the course of a few conversations, he was like, do you want to co-host a masterclass on emotional resilience and maybe do some research to learn more about this, because this feels interesting. And so off the back of that, he mentored me in a way, and I kind of learned a lot from him in terms of building frameworks and being analytical and having a really kind of solid approach to researching this question. And then a series of emotional resilience masterclasses came out of that, which I ran alongside him for a couple of years. And in those masterclasses, the key piece that seemed to really resonate was the piece around the nervous system, around energy management, around using the breath to up and down regulate, conversations around emotions, interoception. So I think this was it was during COVID. Mid 2020, I was like, I feel like there's like a body of work here that wants to be created. And so doing the classic creative thing, I like posted a tweet being like, I'm thinking about doing this course called Nervous System Mastery with like a screenshot of like a super basic curriculum outline. Like, does anyone want to join? And 2 people said like, where can I sign up? Like I'll pay right now. And so I made a Stripe link on the side. I was like, here you go, here's a payment link. And with those 2 deposits, I was like, right, okay, I guess this is happening.
Happening.
Yeah, it was amazing. I entered this deep state of flow where there was this sense of like this thing kind of poured out of me, and I really enjoyed the creative process of like crafting that curriculum and structuring and sequencing the practices in a way that they could make sense and also be relatable to people that hadn't done breathwork trainings and were kind of maybe coming in at multiple different entry points.
One question I have for you is around the positioning and framing of it. Obviously, whatever you put forward on Twitter attracted the right people, but I know some people are not necessarily maybe familiar with even the concept of what does it mean to master your nervous system. So I'm curious if you had any struggles there around how to frame the problem and how to talk about it.
I mean, honestly, I think that is like the number one challenge that I face. And I'm just constantly like you say, using Twitter to just as like a tuning fork and just saying things that come to my mind and seeing what does resonate with other people and maybe where's the pushback and trying to find that way to articulate. because it is a very challenging thing to communicate if it's something that people haven't experienced before. I liked like, there's something about, I mean, you guys have Notion mastery. There was something that was almost like a kind of, like, it breaks your brain a little bit combining nervous system with mastery. Like, there was something about the framing that even if people had no idea what it meant, there's like a curiosity there that's like, wait, how do I master my nervous system? Like, it just happens. It's a kind of automatic thing. I didn't realize that there was agency that I have here. And so I think that's part of what I want to convey, is that there are these skills that we can build and these things that we can learn to cultivate more agency over how our nervous system operates. And kind of borrowing from language from the tech world, you know, like the operating manual for your nervous system, for example. Again, it's kind of combining like this machine-like kind of techniques and protocols and bringing in science to something that also works with feelings and emotions. So I guess I've been constructing various like Trojan horses that I feel like might have resonated with my former self when I was working in the startup world. To varying degrees of success, I would say. Like even people that I'm close with, like our mutual friend Kay, when we were at the mastermind together, he was like, I don't really know what you do. Like what the hell? Like, what the hell is this? It's like, you know, even people that, you know, we're close with and we have conversations with, they don't necessarily get it. So it's for sure.
Explain like I'm a founder, right? Instead of explain like I'm five. Explain like I'm a founder.
Even harder.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Maybe a bit of a segue, but you talk a lot in your work about this concept of interoception, and that was actually one of the things that I had never heard of. And so, like, when I heard that initially, I'm like, interoception? Like, do you mean introspection? Like, that difference between introspection being kind of like the noticing our thoughts, maybe, and I would maybe describe interoception as noticing our feelings in our body. Do you think that that's like kind of an adequate comparison for understanding that? And like, you know, you talk about the importance of cultivating interoception. Can you say more about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like, when I came across this word, it connected so many dots for me, specifically around like being numb from the neck down. And the analogy that I like to use is, if you think of like the 15th century maps, before we kind of discovered where all the continents were, there were these like big here be dragons, like splodges on these uncharted territories. And for me, it felt like my body was this like 15th century map where I had like maybe rough outlines of continents, but there was no definition, and there were these big like blind spots of here be dragons. And so I viewed a lot of what I was doing as like, I love Zelda, I love like fantasy stories. So there was this kind of like, let's go on the inner adventure and kind of fill out these blind spots of these maps. And there's also kind of a lot more emerging literature as well, particularly over the last, I'd say, like 5 to 10 years. Interoception is becoming more and more of interest to the research community. And, you know, findings like people that have ADHD, for example, tend to have low levels of interoception, how low levels of interoception are correlated with PTSD, with various challenges in life. So there's an increasing interest and like body of literature to kind of back this up as well. And it's something that can be cultivated, you know, pretty easily through things like the ape practice that I share in the training, or through yoga nidra and SDR, or just even just like being curious, honestly, just like it's like a skill. And I remember for myself, it was actually during the Vipassana training, the meditation retreat that I did a while back, where for 10 days, you're basically doing a body scan over and over and over again. And I remember on like days 8, 9, and 10, I was like, whoa, I'm like experiencing sensations in parts of my body that I had no idea was even possible. It felt like a superpower. It was like, I have this like magical ability to bring my attention to different parts of my body. And I was like, this is so cool. And I feel like it's important.
I'm curious if interoception can be measured, like you mentioned, around folks with ADHD having low interoception or low levels. You know, it's sort of, how do you measure that? My introduction to interoception probably came from TikTok and seeing people who have ADHD talk about interoception. And I started to think about the ways that, for example, I think hunger cues are not always, I'm not maybe always tuned into those. So sometimes I will accidentally eat 2 lunches or 2 dinners because I actually maybe I don't feel that like satiation, right? And I sort of forget. So there's things like that where I have to set up reminders for myself to do those check-ins. And so I'm just curious, can it be measured? And of course, it's something we can cultivate. So like, what are some ways that we can notice where we're at with our awareness of our interoception?
I love that. I love just the thought of you eating 2 lunches. Like I sometimes eat 2 lunches myself. I'm like,
Okay, so I'm not doing it wrong.
yeah, it's a great question. I'd say that the best assessment out there is something called the MAIA, MAIA. There's actually, MAIA version 2 is I think there's 37 questions, which you can kind of rank yourself on those different areas. And at the end, you get a score. The way that it's measured typically in clinical trials and studies is using how well is someone able to accurately assess the speed of their own heartbeat, which is, it's like a vector of interoception. But to my mind, it actually doesn't capture so much more of the subtlety and nuance that is there. Like I know people that can kind of sense their heartbeat, but they have low interoceptive capacity in other areas. So the MAIA is probably the best out there. It's unfortunately not a very, it's like a kind of crusty PDF that's not very well designed. But I mean, I'm thinking about redesigning it and just, making that more accessible to people.
Yeah.
But those are that's the main way that it's done at the moment, and I would like to see innovations in the way that it is measured more accurately.
Interesting. I'm curious if you're open to chatting about it. You do an amazing job of sharing some of your own personal experiments in your quarterly reports or quarterly reviews, right? You've shared those with your inner community, and you say, here are the things I'm asking myself, here's the experiments that I'm running. And you've mentioned psychedelic work, ayahuasca, things like that, as something that you're interested in experimenting with. I'm kind of curious how you see potentially psychedelics being a tool for improving our own relationship with our nervous system. Are those two things related? Are you seeing, more conversations in the space about that? I'm curious about your thoughts around that and your relationship with psychedelics.
Well, I can start by sharing my own kind of experience and story with psychedelics. So I was invited to sit in an ayahuasca ceremony a few months after losing Sophie, so kind of fairly early on in my grieving journey. And it was 3 nights, and I would say that experience, it shattered my existing rational materialist kind of worldview in a way that I don't know if it would have, I don't know how else that would have happened if it not without the aid of psychedelics at that point. And it really just kind of opened me up to being a student again and being a beginner and realizing that actually I don't have a lot of this stuff figured out. And so I think what psychedelics, and when I say psychedelics, I'm referring to, say, LSD, high-dose psilocybin, ayahuasca as well. They reliably produce a very altered state of consciousness, which, even if there's no kind of tangible benefits on the other side, there will almost certainly be a sense of there is so much about my own way of being in the world that I don't understand. And so for me, it really ignited this curiosity of can I access these states through meditation or through breathwork, and what are the connections? In terms of how it overlaps with the nervous system, I'll use MDMA as an example, which is an empathogen, which isn't strictly a psychedelic. But I recently interviewed Marcella, who was the lead psychotherapist on the MDMA MAPS trials here in Boulder. And they had I think it was a 70-something, maybe 72% reduction in untreatable depression and PTSD symptoms in their trials. And basically the way that I understand how they work is MDMA combined with an appropriate set and setting and, a trained psychotherapist who's there to create safety and hold space. It is effective at surfacing the incomplete reflexes or the unfelt emotions, to use a phrase from earlier in life, and giving them a space to be felt and for those mobilization reflexes essentially to be completed. And that completion process is something that I refer to as paying off our emotional debt. And so I think there absolutely is a role for psychedelics in a context of a very well-held set meaning mindset, kind of like in a mindset, setting meaning like a safe environment, with someone who is trained to hold space for people through big experiences. I think there is absolutely a role for that. I do believe that this can be done effectively without psychedelics, and for many people, it is something of a I guess like a fast track in some ways. In terms of psilocybin and ayahuasca, I think it's a bigger conversation than just nervous system healing as well. I think that the thing that I would like to say is that there's also a pitfall and a danger of people going to something like an ayahuasca ceremony, having this enormous kind of blast off experience, completely disassociating from their body, and then coming back down with like nothing actually changing, but maybe just their ego is being reinforced by having this like big experience that they then, you know, tell everyone about, which
and don't know how to integrate.
And don't know how to integrate. Yeah, integration is a huge challenge for a lot of people as well.
Yeah, great reflection on that. I really appreciate it. Yeah. One of the things that's making me curious about is with your work, you're dealing with nervous system, you're dealing with a lot of anxiety, held emotions with your students. And I'm curious if it ever feels like there's that danger of people maybe treating you like their therapist or trauma dumping or things that are coming up for people. Like, do you ever have to deal with that as a teacher in a space that is kind of asking people to maybe confront their emotions in a difficult way? Is that something that even comes up?
It's for sure something that I'm aware of. I would say it previously used to come up more in a one-on-one context when I was guiding people through breathwork journeys. In the context of the Nervous System Mastery course, I created it in a way where from the very beginning, I kind of want to empower people to experiment for themselves and not project any kind of authority or even like the idea of me being an expert, because that is then disempowering them from running these experiments for themselves. And so if large emotions come up in the live sessions, which sometimes they do, then of course, like I'll kind of hold space and guide people through to a place of like feeling, accepting those. And that's beautiful. I think that's part of it. But if someone messages me privately, shares something, I will generally try and connect them with an in-person somatic therapist if I can, because that in my perspective is the fast track to healing whatever's going on. And if they can't find someone in person, then some people do somatic experiencing through Zoom and things like that, and that's kind of the backup option.
Yeah, there's something about your program. You have this, one of the most beautiful things that was really freeing for me was you talk about the gap in between stimulus and response and freedom being in there. And you reference this quote a lot from Leonard Cohen, that something along the lines of that there's a crack in everything and that's how the light gets in. And this idea of, I know Barrett, one of our last episode guests, was talking about how the cost of joy is grief. And I found that through like the somatic experience, doing that work. Yes, the psychedelics can have that impact of widening that gap really well, but it kind of like after the sessions, it can kind of snap back. But it's like now that gap is kind of there. And so now you can go into the somatic work and really look at that gap. So to me, it's almost like it provides an initial awareness of those cracks where maybe you thought everything was solid and nothing is allowed in. Now you're aware of the cracks after experiencing that. And I think like maybe for some people, like it's really difficult to get them to notice those cracks without some kind of getting them up to the starting line. And then once they're there, they can take a step back from the assisted stuff and start going internal as well. So now I think of everything now, because I've always said I used to take like Effexor and all this different stuff for managing my anxiety. And what I felt like those pharmaceuticals gave me was like a little bit of a pause from when that thought becomes a feeling and then kind of settles into your body. So you're able to like make some moves or think about how is this going to land in my body. And I felt now, my awareness is expanded from the neck down, that I have much more control over noticing those gaps and widening those gaps over time. And it's just like the more that you notice those gaps, the more wide they become. And it's very freeing in that feeling. No question, I guess. I'm just wondering if like how that resonates for you.
Can I hire you to help me talk about nervous system? Yeah, I think I shared the Leonard Cohen quote about there was a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. That was that was kind of the biggest epiphany for me during the grief journey, in that I remember when I was by her memorial bench and just kind of tears streaming down my face. But the feeling, like when I kind of let go of the story of like, oh, I've lost my fiance, the feeling was just like, it was like joy and connection and like rawness and aliveness. And there was so much beauty there. And I was like it almost didn't make sense. I was like, but wait, grief is meant to be bad and hard and sucks, which it can be. But when there wasn't any resistance in my system to that kind of like tsunami of feeling and energy moving through, it was so beautiful. And I think that's part of what I've and that in itself was such a reframe, because since then it took me a while, but like now my kind of story of these challenging emotions is like there's something here for me to feel into, and I'll feel so much expansion and joy and connection on the other side of this. So I'm going to actually like go into this and get curious about this. And, Joe Hudson's work has been fantastic for that as well. I know he's been on the podcast too, but it really was that reframe of like, wow, like grief can be beautiful. And like, and it's funny, there was a period of time where I was grieving not being in the depths of grief for a while, because there was such a sense of like connection and rawness and aliveness that I felt, which when I kind of went back to like mundane Johnny existence, it's like I lost both ends of the spectrum, and I was like, I miss that in a weird way. And then that brought up confusion of like, wait, that's weird, like
I'm supposed to feel like this.
Yeah, exactly. It was like questioning all the stories of like how you're supposed to feel in different contexts.
There's always a real tension there. I love one of my favorite memes. I don't remember his last name, but Visa on Twitter, I'm sure you're aware of him, and he has the laughing my ass off meme where he's got, the ship sailing between, it's like from the Odyssey, Charybdis and Scylla, and on one side says life is incredibly meaningless, and on the other side is life is incredibly meaningful. And like the ship is just sailing through those two dangers and just being like, hey, like, whatever, like we'll figure this out. And, that tension in wanting to feel, I should be feeling grief, I should be feeling joy, but being in between that tension and just kind of soldiering on is such a, I think for me has become a really meaningful meme almost that I try to live by.
It's funny you mentioned the meaning piece, in that kind of questioning like what is the meaning of life was like one of the things I was wrestling with before this. And something about both the plant medicine experiences and grief, there was a sense of like, oh, like that's a stupid question. Like there is a certain state of being where to even ask that question feels ridiculous. It's like the meaning is inherent in certain states of being. And sometimes you forget that. And then it's like, okay, how do I find my way back into that state where everything feels like inherently like drenched in meaning?
Yeah. I had another thing written from one of your statements where you were talking about clean emotional expression, and that clarity lies on the other side of feeling. And that's a sense of having that clean emotional expression. And so like that, it sounds like for you at least, that grief became that thing that you, on the other side of the grief, became this beautiful, expressive joy that, seems to have led to this amazing course and community and all this work that you've done. So having that clarity on that grief is, and, I like Barrett said, the cost of joy is grief. So getting to that point is really beautiful. I'm really happy for you. It's like I just see the work that you're doing, and it makes me super happy to see somebody that seems to just be really at the edge of comfort and creating something really meaningful. It's always really inspiring. So I definitely appreciate the work you're doing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it always is so beautiful hearing other people's reflections of their experience as well, and just how I shared this with Joe the other day of like, I feel like teaching this course is almost a forcing function for me to be a perpetual student in a way of like learning about how other people view this, and then seeing how that reflects in my own experience. And yeah, I mean, fingers crossed it continues that way. Like if either of you kind of see me preaching myself as like an expert on Twitter, feel free to just like call me out and like yo, Johnny, like what are you doing? Like
No,
So
I feel
it's
like curiosity is in your DNA, the way you show up
Hmm.
on Twitter, the way you're asking questions. Like, I really do feel like that's a part of how you show up in the world. And it's really, I don't know, it's cool to see because your curious nature, I think, will spark other people to be a little more curious and to ask more
mm,
and better questions.
mm. Thank you. I certainly hope so. It'd be fun if that's the case.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about even what your work looks like behind the scenes. I know that your work kind of started to take more shape during COVID, and I think I kind of went through the same thing where suddenly there was this weird gap in time. Travel is closed. Suddenly we have a lot more time on our hands and things kind of shifted. And I felt like that was a time for me to go really, really deep and get into that creative flow. It sounds like you kind of did the same thing too. Do you think like in a weird way, COVID was this bubble that was kind of a forcing function that enabled this work to maybe get out sooner than it would have otherwise? Or yeah, I'm kind of curious your relationship with that weird bubble in time that, for
Mm.
me was kind of like a big catalyst.
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, it took my wife and I to Bali for COVID, and even, there being in a different time zone and just kind of somewhat disconnected from everything else. I don't think that I would have, gone online first for the course because originally the workshops were in person. They were meant to continue being in
Mm,
person. And I had my doubts about like, how much could actually be taught in a virtual environment. I still don't do things like I don't do breathwork online. There's certain kind of practices which I think are only suited for an in-person kind of setting. So what that was kind of a challenge for me of like I wonder like to what degree can true transformation be possible through an online only setting. And I think
mhm.
where I've settled is that the course as it stands feels like a powerful on-ramp to really like sparking people's curiosity about like, maybe I am going to look for a somatic practitioner on the other side of this, or and giving people enough tools that will, hopefully serve them no matter what path they go down, from cultivating interoception to breathing practices to self-regulate, and then even just learning the theory and having like a couple of guided recordings of like, okay, I'm feeling a challenging emotion right now. Here's how I can, if I choose to, kind of lean into it and see what might be on the other side.
Amazing. So the in-person stuff is it's still very alive for you. I know you mentioned I think you posted on Twitter about potentially looking to do a men's retreat, right? So that's sounds like something you're looking to pursue more, and hopefully Ben will get to attend one of these in the future when the timing
Definitely.
Yeah.
aligns. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to do a men's retreat in 6 weeks' time. It'll be the second one that I've done. And for me, that's more, there's a certain nourishment that comes from like doing these things in person that is hard. It's rewarding in a different way doing it online, I
Yeah.
think. And yeah,
Yeah.
I want to, particularly now it feels like the foundations are kind of in place. I want to think about how to create probably small, intimate, in-person experiences for those who want to go deeper.
What are some of the things you're still wrestling with, if anything, in terms of the online version of the course? I know you mentioned the positioning of it, finding the right language to communicate the value of it. What are some of the things, the challenges maybe that you're encountering in running an online course, whether it's the launching piece, whether it's updating the content over time or collecting feedback or, filling the seats? What are some of the challenges that you're currently facing?
Yeah, great question. So I think one thing that I've been aware of recently, well, the two main things. One is that I have, 15 kind of different projects that I'd love to try, and right now it's just me and our community manager. So I'm like
Mm.
really trying to like ruthlessly prioritize. Okay, like I have like, two big punts that I can make, and I have to I have to just choose those two and not try and overcommit and do everything at once. But I guess that's a problem for everyone, really. I think another piece is, yeah, investing in assets that appreciate over time. So currently, a lot of people hear about the course through Twitter, through sponsoring newsletters, through my podcast and referrals. And I'm realizing that it means that there has to be kind of a large amount of energy output in the run up to each cohort. And what I'd love to do, and learning from you guys, is like start a YouTube channel and write more long form blog posts and things which will hopefully appreciate in terms of the number of people that find out about them over time, and
Yeah.
kind of building a more sustainable way of promoting the course is certainly something that's alive. And Yeah, and I think also wanting to do this and continue to grow, also hoping to kind of continue growing this course in a way that I still get to like experience joy and the fun of doing it. Because I know that if I was to treat it purely as, a business, there are certain things which I could do to, optimize conversions and sales funnels and things, which I come from a marketing background, so I have that capacity, but it's not my zone of joy. So I'm like focusing my time on the things which both I think will be impactful, but also feel fun. Like sharing memes on Twitter is a great example of like it kind of bridges both. Like least applications, I have fun. It's like
Yeah.
win-win.
Do you have thoughts around how small or big your team will grow? Like how do you feel? Like you said, it's you and a community manager. Do you have any plans to hire more team members or even working with your partner? Is that something that you're considering doing? What might that look like for you?
Yeah, I'm interested in, I think, like strategic aligned projects with freelancers or contractors. So I'm quite resistant to bringing on full-time employees, although that would certainly be the most effective way to, I think, scale. I think I'm still wanting to kind of run these experiments basically and work with super smart people on specific projects. At least for now, like that might change, and maybe there's a part of me that's resisting, being a leader of a team in this way. But for me,
It's
at
a whole
least up
different
until
skill
now,
set.
yeah, I feel like I keep there's more kind of capacity for me to change my mind, to move fast, to try new things.
Yeah.
So whilst I could grow in one direction with a team, and I also don't feel like it would be ready for that as well. I think it would be premature to hire a bunch of people and scale.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're excited to see where you take the course and however we can support you. We just adore you and adore your work. So however we can support, please don't ever hesitate to ask.
Oh, that's really kind. And I'm excited we get to spend more time in person this year as well.
Absolutely.
Hang out more. Yeah, and honestly, I mean, I don't know if even the name Nervous System Mastery would have come into my consciousness had I not been aware of you guys as well. Yeah.
No
There was
way. That's
probably a
pretty
degree of
cool.
like shameless stealing from on my
Oh,
part.
hey, and honestly, I think I probably stole it from Mastering ConvertKit or ConvertKit Mastery. So
Beautiful.
it's all out there to be remixed, right?
I was like, I really like what these guys are doing. Like, I wonder if I can replace Notion with Nervous System, and
It works.
seems to be working. Yeah.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, love
Well,
it,
thanks
Jonny.
for
Where's the
chatting with us,
best place
Jonny.
for people to find you? We know about your, Curious Humans podcast. We'll include the link below. N Mastery, N System Mastery.
nsmastery.com is the site for the
NSmastery.
Nervous System Mastery course. And yeah, the applications are open right now for the spring cohort. And yeah, and then Twitter. If anyone listening is on Twitter, I love spending time there and having conversations there. And also, there's a podcast episode with Joe Hudson, and I think for people that might be curious about like digging deeper into some of these topics, there's some more kind of specific conversations on the Curious Humans podcast that go into psychedelics, go into breathwork, things like that. So that would be a good kind of jumping off point for people that want to learn more.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your generosity and just being with us here today. It's always awesome.